my name is Jessica Sickler. I'm heading up the research team on the Teen Science Café Movement project. And I am based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I don't know if we have any Pennsylvanians, but here I am. And I'll let Michelle introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Michelle Lentzner. I work with Jessica, one of her associates, and I'm located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Awesome. And so we are here to share with you today a little bit about the annual report, and then we really want to hear from you guys about what's up with your programs and what's going on. So as I know you all know, every year the network sends out a survey to all the cafes to learn more about sort of what's going on with your program, where you are, how you're working, and that is largely because they are required to report back to NSF, who is helping fund this initiative and providing this support. Beyond that, beyond just the reporting to NSF, it really does help the national network, Louis and Michelle and Mike, in planning the larger network and helping them just sort of keep track of all the cafes, where they are, whether they're still running, how you're doing. It helps demonstrate the value of the network and the reach of your cafes to sort of keep that value story going. And for the network, where their objective is to really support and help you all with your cafe programs, it helps them to sort of understand the range of what you're doing and probably more importantly, the needs and areas for support, which is really what I'm hoping we're going to get into today a little bit, is how they can support you best. So that's the why it matters to them, but it does also help you, we think. It's just another thing we want to emphasize is that tracking and reporting these data on an annual basis can help you just know things like which cafe topics or activities are seeming to attract teens, where you're popular and where maybe less so. It helps you tell the story of your impact, your reach, your value to your host organization or external stakeholders if you know about who's coming and what they're valuing. And it can even guide your strategy, right? To know who's coming and to know who's missing. Getting information is sort of a power to you. At least that's how we see it and why we encourage this annual reporting on a lot of levels. So that's enough of me. I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to share a little bit of what we saw in the snapshot from this past year, which we know was a rough one.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so all of these reports, together from all the cafes across the country really help us to think about the state of the Teen Café network as a whole, which is helpful. So unsurprisingly, considering the year that we've had, about half of all teen cafes that reported were suspended at some point during the 20 to 21 year. But that also includes about 40% of cafes that were either running normally or were active, but like somewhat constrained. And by constrained, we mean maybe they're doing fewer programs, maybe they're working with smaller audiences. A lot of that constrained category are the cafes that were doing virtual programming that maybe didn't look like their normal programming, where things are just a little bit tougher. So, some of these cafes are currently in the process of restarting or thinking about restarting. And then, unfortunately, we did have some cafes that ended permanently due to the pandemic. So we got those too. So among all of the cafes that remained open during the pandemic, meaning that they did not permanently close, over half of them were doing virtual events, at least one virtual event per year. Very few of them had in-person events. That is not a surprise, considering, again, what we've been dealing with this year. And then there were, under half that just weren't able to do events at all. And those are the ones that, tended to be temporarily suspended or restarting, that kind of thing. Go next. Yeah, so we asked cafes to share some success stories, which are always my favorite part of this kind of data. And a lot of the success stories this year kind of revolved around making that transition to virtual events, which in some cases had really amazing silver linings for cafes. Things like, expanding their reach, reaching new teens in different areas, being able to send their teens to go see cafes from other parts of the country that were really specialized to their interests, hosting international cafes, which is amazing. Don't know who that was, but kudos to them. That's awesome. And even like expanding their audiences and having interactive virtual programming. So those things, I mean, that really speaks to the resilience of the network, because it's been a tough year, and the fact that our sites are still doing this is pretty incredible. Next one. Obviously, there were also challenges, as I think no one is surprised by that. Challenges that the cafes experienced this year tended to revolve around recruitment of new team leaders. Obviously, it is hard to find teens when they are at home versus at school or coming to your cafes. Creating engaging cafes or like engaging activities in the same way that, cafes would have been in person is hard. And also collaborative teamwork, working with teens, trying to get a lot of those behind the scenes processes going in terms of meeting with your teens, getting them to really lead and take decision making. That was a bigger challenge when you're doing things virtually. So that's something that came up as well. Awesome. One of the biggest takeaways that we found is that, tracking demographic data is hard, and less than a third of cafes are currently doing that. And that includes participation data as well. So collecting this information, it doesn't need to be complicated, but it can really help your cafe and your network to really understand who they're serving and what kinds of teens you're really interacting with. All right. Oh yeah, there we go. So like without reliable demographic data, we can't really tell if each cafe is actually, attracting diverse teens, which is one of those really important things that we're aiming for, or the extent to which teens attending cafes really reflect the demographics of their area. And where you might be really strong and where you might want to try and target new audiences to come to your cafes. All right, so that's why it's good and valuable, and we hope that you're so excited to collect demographic data. So now the question is how? How can we do this? How can we help you do this? So we did reach out to cafes that are currently collecting demographic data, and we asked them, what are you doing? What's working? What's challenging? And we found that cafes are currently collecting data in one of two main ways. So the first one is during event registration, before the event has started, you easily capture everyone who is going to come to your event, they're registering. It's pretty simple. Some of the drawbacks might be that, a lot of people are like, yay, I'm gonna register, I'll be there. And then they don't show up. Something came up, you might have different numbers compared to actual attendance. You're also not able to collect any data about the cafe itself, like if they were satisfied, if it was interesting, if they have feedback about that event. But generally Zoom is pretty good in terms of, asking those couple key questions that can be either short, closed-ended or open-ended answers, and you can get demographics that way. Next. So yeah, the second one that, a lot of cafes do is like a post-event survey. There are two ways that cafes are doing this based on whether they're doing it virtually or in person. A lot of cafes obviously have moved into virtual, and that can create some other, sort of benefits and limitations. So obviously in this way, you can get other information like satisfaction, interest level, all that sort of stuff. Virtually, a lot of cafes shared with us that low response rates can be kind of tricky. It's not super thrilling for teens to do a survey, especially online. Getting them to click a link and then finish a survey can be hard. We know this. So then for in-person events, So this tended to be a little bit, at least based on what we heard from cafes, this tended to be a little bit more successful. As long as you kept it really short, you can ask those few key questions that you really want to know from your attendees, and do it in like a quarter sheet or a half sheet, something small, and then give them a reward at the end. If they give it to you, give them, a sucker, a pencil, something like that. If you're asking for a longer survey, this can get, again, trickier. The more questions, the more open-ended answers, the less likely your teens are going to be super thrilled about doing a survey for you at the end of your Teen Science Cafe. But it is really valuable information. So we have some other ideas of fun ways that we can collect feedback and information from teens during in-person events. These are obviously not appropriate for things like demographics and gender, because those are more sensitive questions. But if you're interested in stuff like, what was your favorite part of the event today, or what future topics might you be interested in? You can do things like, we have the image on the left is pom-pom voting. So, for Teen Science Cafes, these are obviously both from art museums. But for Teen Science Cafes, you can get everyone a few pom-poms as they walk in and say, okay, go vote over there, drop your pom-pom into whatever bucket you think is whatever you want them to answer. So it's just a fun way to answer questions. It's not written. Same with the stickers to the right. And this one is actually really kind of brilliant because it gives different colored stickers to new attendees versus returning attendees. So you can see, who's answering what. But if you wanted to say something like, what was your favorite part of today? Put it on a board, have people put stickers there. You'll get some really great information. And again, it does not feel like a long survey. Not pictured, but also really useful is if you're looking at, zip code or more informal location data, putting up a map with a bunch of push pins is also a really fun way to get teens to just give you an idea of like where they're located. Snap a picture of it at the end, do it again for the next event and see if there's a change. It can give you a lot of really valuable data without, having to write a lot of things down or make it really formal.
Yeah. So we hope those are a few ideas from the network and then also from our experience. So just ways that maybe we can make it feel a little less daunting to get all that information that they ask about in your annual survey, because if you track it throughout the year, it's going to make life easier in May when Louis and Michelle and Mike send out that check-in form for you. So that's sort of our main goal today, is we want to talk about some of those ideas. And because one of those questions is demographic data, the ethnicity, the race of participants, because that's one of those things NSF would love to hear us reporting on, and I know is a goal of many cafes. We also wanted to really stress for everyone that it's really important to collect demographic data in really ethical and culturally responsive ways. And it's a thing our field as evaluators and researchers have been thinking a lot about. So we wanted to share a few tips from the perspective of survey design that we really want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about how you're writing these questions, what questions you're asking. One of the first is only ask a question if you will use the data, especially about personal information. I'm sure you've had a survey you've encountered in your life where they like ask your household income and you're like, why do you need to know that? Because it feels kind of invasive if it, doesn't make sense. So the same thing goes here. Do you need to know zip code? Are you going to be able to use that? Do you need to know gender identity? You may, to report on things. Do you need to know parents' education level? If you're not going to use it, don't ask it. Or the kind of ridiculous example I've shown here of asking a very invasive personal question. If you don't have a really good reason, don't ask that. It's just one piece of advice we always start out with.
Also, if possible, we like to let teens identify themselves in their own words. So, we've all become more attuned in recent years to the fact that many aspects of identity, which is really what demographics are, they're really complex for some individuals. And things like gender or racial and ethnic identity, using short open-ended text boxes instead of or in addition to check boxes can make a huge difference in the way that teens react to your survey and how they feel, like their comfort level at your cafe, because your survey is a part of that cafe experience and you want that to be as inclusive as possible. And this just allows a teen to tell you how they identify, using whatever language feels most appropriate to them. And in terms of reporting that back, it's not terribly hard for you to go through and put those open-ended responses into any boxes that you might need afterwards, while you're still letting the teens tell you who they are instead of forcing them to sort of acclimate to what you need them to say.
And this is probably just an add-on to what Michelle just said. If you are using check boxes, and I understand, and that is easier for kids to just check off, just make sure you have inclusive options and that you allow that option for self-identification, not sort of other identity, but a way for them to tell you they identify differently than whatever is in the boxes. And this is where I always like to share an anecdote from an evaluation I was doing with middle school and high school students at a science center. And this had to have been 5 years ago. And we had the gender identity question of male, female, identify differently. And I will admit, yes, we got a few jokey responses in kids who thought it was funny to have a different identity option. But we also got kids who wrote in the margins a thank you to us for having an inclusively worded question, even if they identified with one of the binary options. Like, they recognized that, as Michelle said, this was a signal that, we are inclusive just in the way we word our questions. So that really struck home for me why this was so important in just how I chose to word a survey question.
Similarly, allowing an option to opt out, there should always be I prefer not to say, or making this, if you are doing it, online, don't make that question required. Just allowing them to not be comfortable answering that is really, really important. And when in doubt, use your teen leaders as reviewers, let them read your survey, or whatever you're planning to do to try and collect this information and see how it feels to them. Is something hard to answer? Is something too long? Does it not quite feel right? Because they're also a part of your audience and they will absolutely be able to help you and guide you in that. Okay, so we also have some tips for creating surveys for teens that will make them dislike it less, we hope. The first one, and I think these are all pretty simple, but it's funny how things get in the way of them a lot of times. But the first one is absolutely keep it short. Keep it as short as possible. Only ask what is essential to know, what you will actually use and act on. If you are doing a survey online, a lot of times being able to tell the teens ahead of time, it's only 5 questions, it's only going to take you 2 minutes. Being able to honestly say that to them makes a huge difference. Keeping it simple, using open-ended questions sparingly. It's so much easier to just, and I know we just said open-ended, for demographics, you want that option to be there. But if you're asking about something like satisfaction, or what was your favorite part? Giving them closed-ended answers versus making them write you a book is going to be much, much more helpful for them, and frankly, easier for you on the other end of figuring out how to use that data. And if you are in person, or if you have amazing ideas on how to do this virtually, we want to hear them. But if you can incentivize or reward teens in some way, do it. It's amazing what people will do for a piece of candy or a pencil or a sticker. They will do amazing things for you. So even just having a very low cost perk, especially something that's visible that everyone else has. If everyone has a sucker and they don't, they want to fill out that survey for you. So use that magic, use that herd mentality to your benefit, especially in in-person events.
Totally. All right, so those are some of our hot tips, and honestly what we've heard from others in the network that they've been able to do and implement successfully, which were just awesome success stories. And we want to encourage more of you to take whatever that next step is in getting a little more or a little better or a little more usable data or being able to manage it better. So we wanted to have time for some discussion, and these were our thoughts on topics that we could discuss as a group. And I'm going to let Louis help us moderate and facilitate how this works best in a webinar format. But we're curious, any of you who are out there, how you are collecting demographics or tracking your teens or tracking repeat participation. Anything you're doing is great to share because we'd love to hear it. And then even more, we're curious about what are your biggest barriers? What feels challenging about this question of tracking participation, tracking who teens are, getting that demographic information? And in service of that, how could the network help you make that a little bit easier, make it just a little bit easier for you to fill out that annual report when it comes in June, since cafes happen throughout the year?
If anyone wants to respond by talking, just raise your hand and I'll go about it that way. So it looks like we have Cynthia. So I'll go ahead and allow Cynthia to talk.
Okay. I just wanted to say great job presenting the demographic part. I think that's been something that's really helped us over the years since I've done the cafe, and I have only been doing it since 2017. But to learn your demographics is really important because then we've been able to target different high schools in our area and different guidance counselors at the high schools and different science teachers to try and get the word out. So I think that's been very helpful. The only other thing I'd say is we incentivize ours by doing a drawing at the end of the cafe, and we get our gift cards from Chick-fil-A. They've been very supportive. And so they give us a $10 gift card. We have a drawing that is based on the registration and then who shows up and attends the cafe. So we have someone monitoring that during the cafe. So by the end, we know who's attending and who's filled out that registration. And that's how we kind of incentivize them to register before they show up, whether in person or on the virtual.
That's awesome. That's a great example of, and it looks like Jen Parsons mentioned in the chat that they're using gift card incentives, like a random drawing for that. And of something small and from a local vendor, you know how like every time you run the community 5K and it's got 1,000 logos on the back, right? But this is a pretty easy way for a business to market itself to teens. That's pretty cool. Yeah, and that registration you mentioned, we definitely heard that from other cafe sites, that it's sort of an upside of the Zoom world, so long as we're stuck in it, is that you can require, you know, to prevent Zoom bombing, you require those registrations, and it's a place to get data.
I don't know if I'm still unmuted, but real quick, one other thing we did in person when they were coming in person was we had a teen advisor leader set up front with a little laptop. Could be an iPad or a laptop. We had the names from the last cafe that had registered on there, just the first name and the school. They would come in, identify themselves, and we could check off those boxes as they came through into the main meeting area. So it was like a little check-in, and that way we knew we had emergency contact for the person. We knew how many people were in the building, and it was something our team leaders set up and did. So it was a way, and then we could communicate with people again through their email if they wanted to give us their email so that they were reminded of the next cafe topic.
That's awesome. So smart. I love that. Allison posed a great question in the chat. I don't know if anyone has an answer either in the chat or if you're brave enough to come up on mic about, so has anyone found whether asking the teens to pre-register has been a barrier to participation? Or those sort of trade-offs that you're finding? Jen's adding a lot of last-minute registrations right before the Zoom meeting, but no real data about whether or not it's a barrier. And you know, I think that's been true for adults. I've been hearing from folks who run webinars that you promote it in advance, but it's sort of that like last 24, 48 hours is when people commit, or at least a chunk of people commit. Oh, and we got some hands up. Okay.
We'll start off with India, then Michelle and Cynthia.
Thank you for unmuting me, and thank you for a great presentation. This has been really informative for a beginner adult leader of a Teen Science Cafe chapter. I just have a question for the group, which is, how are you linking participants or people who are interested in participating in a cafe? How are you actually literally linking them to the registration webpage? Are you, when I was working with my teens, they were talking about QR codes that could be printed on a flyer so kids could scan them with their phone. We also thought about, you know, doing a virtual flyer with a hyperlink. This might seem like a small detail, but now that I think of it, maybe it's not, because kids, you know, teens are on their phones all the time. Have you found mobile friendly ways or mobile phone friendly ways to distribute registration links? Maybe that could prevent certain barriers. I don't know.
I have a quick response to that. Thank you for asking that question, India. You're really on target with the QR codes and the hyperlinks that can be shared within the flyers. Those are things that I know I've seen over time and that I've deployed a few times in my cafe pre-pandemic. You may want to consider the Remind app as well, and Slack. A lot of times, like if students are using some type of back channel communication, their school might even have some type of back channel communication that they use to post announcements and share information. So all of that, like embedding and cross-linking, is really helpful, because then it'll allow the teens to find that registration page in addition to like the use of social media. So there's a lot of different ways to cross-channel and cross share that information.
Nice, thank you, Louis.
Absolutely.
Slack is also useful for tracking what the team leaders are doing, because if they use the Slack, I was able to follow who was getting the food for the event, who was doing the introductions, all these things that they did a planning meeting virtually, and you know, everybody knew what their role was.
Thank you, Michelle. And it looks like in the chat we do have some really good commentary. There's the use of a program called Peachjar to be doing some emailing. And Andy raised an interesting point about teens in underrepresented communities may not have access to the smartphone devices, and cell coverage might not always be available. So also being able to consider other ways and other avenues of getting that registration set up. I think from a practitioner standpoint, it very much is like, how can you work with your teams to maybe do some of that paper registration and do some of that tracking and some data entry into Excel spreadsheets or Google Sheets down the road, or some other tracking system. So it really is working with your teams and really understanding your community in what works best. So these are definitely some really good ideas that are being shared. There's a lot of activity going on in the chat box. Alex, thanks for joining in, neighbor to the north in Colorado, and being able to look at some of those chat resources. Since we're recording this will be really helpful to go back and see what people have shared. So yeah, we can go ahead and compile that, and what would I say, maybe put this in a blog post of how to communicate with your teams. That might be something that we can do.
Yeah, and I think another thing, I'm gonna spoiler alert this, that I know Mike Mayhew and Michelle and Louis have been working on and hope to send out very soon, is just some more tips and guidance for you on this sort of ongoing tracking of teams things. So there's both the promoting side, which we know is super important, but then the tracking side. And I know Mike's been thinking real hard about how to support you all in doing this work. So you should expect a lot of resources, and all of these links, absolutely. I'm like, what's Peachjar? I need to find this out. You guys have so many ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was going to explain Peachjar real quick for y'all. It's a the schools in South Carolina, most of them have gone to this paperless way of communicating with parents. So they have an email system set up, and it's by school, and it's a paid service. So if you are an organization that's a nonprofit, you can send out one thing a month through this without paying anything. Like if you're a library or museum, a nonprofit, if they approve you, you can send out one communication per month, and they go by exactly the days of the month. So it's very limited, but we've been able to send our calendar out monthly to the parents so they can see what's coming up, and then they remind their children. So that's been helpful. And this Peachjar thing, if we had funding, you can actually buy so many, they call them tokens, and then use them per school, middle school, whatever in your districts. But we have so many schools that we found it was just easier to go the free route and send out our whole year calendar at one time with the links to registration at the top. And then the parents actually sometimes register the kids, and the kids don't always come, but at least we know parents know we exist and they are supporting us. And so it's been great.
That is amazing. I had no idea such things existed. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Are there any other like big challenges that y'all are wrestling with when it comes to just keeping track of this data, or recording it, or filling out that annual report when it comes in May and June? Any big challenges that we can help think about how to support you and give you some tools for?
Paul has posed an interesting question, and I'll go ahead and read this out to the group. How long will virtual programs be the main way to implement cafes? When do leaders feel that in-person events will start up? Would participants be required to wear masks?
Have you all talked about it in New Mexico for how you're going to handle it? I know it's a very fluid situation these days, but have you guys dealt with it yet?
New Mexico has been pretty good on COVID. We are one of the least the cases now, and have been for probably 9 months. We're still off and on with masks. They haven't really, I think that our high school is going to go full time, no virtual this at the start, but we can't really tell how this is going to fall out, depending on what happens in the first couple months of school. So we're prepared to do hands-on, probably make some kits or get things that are online that we can do for hands-on. But many of our scientists are still willing to come. Others aren't due to health issues of their own. But we're moving forward.
Yeah, and Jen Parsons had followed up with an interesting comment that the program is focused on starting in-person cafes in Ohio this fall, but schools aren't allowing visitors in. That's very similar to my local high school. Of course, it does pose a challenge to recruiting efforts, and libraries aren't open for programming. So while there may be that interest in meeting in person, the venues might have specific requirements, such as the library example here that may not have in-person activities, or schools might not have visitors allowed. So there definitely is a lot of navigation and fluidity during these times from what we're hearing and seeing as well.
I also want to add, just after reading through all of this really rich data from the annual report, I just want to emphasize how diverse a lot of these communities and circumstances are. Like, Teen Science Cafes are all over the country, and it's, I think it's one of the strengths of the network, but it's also really challenging in circumstances like this, because everyone's adjusting to those different surroundings and community needs, and what can we do, what are the barriers. So I think that's it's a great question, but it's so complicated to answer to come up with a single answer that's going to apply to everyone. The range of experiences wide.
See, a great comment from Cynthia in the chat. We must make sure we save this chat, which is some great ideas of how we can support, getting some of that data. Just the data management side, I think, is sort of what the subtext I'm seeing in there, which I know Michelle Lentzner and I were talking about is a huge challenge, right? So once you start collecting it, then it's about how do I manage this data? How do I keep track of it from month to month to month, to aggregate it, to tell, the network, to feed that back into the network. So maybe we can provide some at least some guidance, if nothing else. And this is sort of a bigger strategy that maybe is worth considering. It's great. Yeah, and it does sound like a lot of folks, you're probably in this sort of weird as standby, as Alex called it. I think that was well said, of sort of figuring things out and seeing where things go, that we're back in this weird state of flux of not being quite sure where we're going to land in the next few weeks or months or anything. So encourage everyone to get vaccinated. I will just say that. But yeah. Well, if we have a few minutes here at the end, I was hoping to reserve a little bit of time for the bonus feature of this webinar. Hope it's a bonus feature, which is we also wanted to give you a little bit of update on the actual research side of the Teen Science Café Movement grant that we're doing with NSF, because the sort of checking in is sort of a routine part of the process, but we are also sort of engaging in some deeper research questions where we're trying to figure out how things are working within the cafes, and as we strive towards this goal of creating a movement. So I am going to screen share one more time and just give you a snapshot of where we are in the research. And if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them. And there may be some opportunities for you to get involved in ways that I think are more fun than just taking a survey. Although certainly we have those as well. All right, again, this is like the test of my tech skills. And now that is in the way. Okay. So here's where we are with the research phase. So where we started, we did a baseline survey sort of at the beginning, and you did help us by completing that survey of each individual adult leader and staff who's involved in these cafes. And we found out what the network is best at from our starting point, our real assets we're building on, which is sort of giving that basic support and helping people get better and see where they're going. We also found out where the network has room to grow and room to improve, which were really a lot of the things that we were prioritizing to build in the current grant. So we want to build a better sense of connection amongst the network members, to give you more ownership in the network, and sort of creating these bonds and relationships so that, again, you can really be this professional community helping each other grow. So this is sort of our baseline and where we're hoping to grow and do better by serving you, by serving all of you, the members. And from some of that data, as I'm sure you've noticed, Louis and Michelle and Mike at the national office have been really focusing their PD on topics that you told us you really wanted to hear more about, right? Restarting TSV's post-pandemic. We hoped we would be post-pandemic. Now it's sort of like mid-post-pandemic. Keeping teen leaders engaged while working virtually. I know you guys did an awesome webinar series on that topic, and just keeping these ideas going. So this has been guiding the PD strategies that have been happening. We've also been working on using the data to help the PD folks think about matches between where this side is where members told us they had a lot of expertise, and then the right side is where we were seeing folks saying, I'd really like to improve in this area. And so on some of those, there are areas where we can sort of transfer expertise between members. And so the Louis and company have been thinking a lot about that and how they can help you there. What's coming next? And this is where I hope some of you will be quite intrigued and interested in helping out is, we, the research team, want to create a tool that will help cafe leaders really self-assess their strengths and their areas for growth along the 6 guiding principles of Teen Science Cafes, which I'm sure look very familiar to you. And we started out by doing some interviews with some of y'all in the audience who've been doing this for a long time to talk about what it really looks like to implement these different principles. And one thing we noticed is that it's not a linear list like we often share it, but there's a lot of interrelationships between those different principles, which is sort of what this is showing here. And as we really talked to experienced teen adult leaders, we heard that the principle of creating an engaging cafe program is often at the top of the list. And it's often what folks focus on when they think, what is a cafe? They think of the event. But a really experienced adult leaders told us over and over again that it's not really a Teen Science Cafe with the other principles. It's just a program, right? You can put on a program. This is about all those other things coming together, which led us to a metaphor. It's a little controversial, we admit, but I like it, so I'm just going to go with it for now, and we can change it later, is the iceberg metaphor. That really the model and the principles of a Teen Science Cafe. You've got the tip of the iceberg, which is the stuff people see, the programs and the teens that are coming, but there's all this other really important stuff happening below the surface, and that's what makes those principles 1 and 5 really sing, is the work all of y'all are doing to achieve this. And so that was really a good starting point for us in thinking about, okay, how do we help you assess your strengths and your challenges as you're moving forward? And so that's where we are now. We've sort of fleshed out some of what we were hearing about these principles and how you're enacting them. And our next steps are this fall, probably in September. We're going to try and convene sort of a focus group style, a discussion with a few adult leaders to really refine where we are with this, to take a look at what we heard about what makes you really successful, like when you nailed it in one of these principles, and what it looks like when you're sort of getting there, you're pretty solid, you're making progress, and what it looks like when you're still figuring out one of those 6 guiding principles in that iceberg diagram. Because we know you are the experts on what it really looks like in the ground in this diverse sea of Teen Science Cafes, as Michelle Lentzner said so well a little bit ago. So if any of this is really appealing to you and you're like me and you've got a lot of opinions about things, then I want you to email me and say, hey, I would totally love to sit and talk with you about what it looks like to be successful or to be struggling with the principles of an awesome Teen Science Cafe.